Variants are the secret weapon when it comes to responsive design. They're the perfect way to help us keep track of exactly what is changing across our different breakpoints, while enforcing consistent logic for how our design should respond. So in this lesson, we're going to lay the foundation for how we can leverage variants in our responsive design. Let's dive in. Let's start by setting the stage for exactly what types of changes we can expect to be making across our different breakpoints. The first is we might have updates to these atoms and subcomponents, things like a button, for instance. And those can be part of larger organisms that will also be making changes to. And then lastly, we have entire page layouts that will be updating across our different breakpoints as well. Now, variants can play a huge role in how we organize those changes at all three of these levels. And I'll show you what I mean by breaking each one down here. So let's start with our responsive atoms. Now I've used a button component because that's something that pretty much everyone has regardless of how mature their design system is. And the important thing to highlight here is what can change between our two different breakpoints. We have web and mobile here. Now the first set of changes is pretty obvious. Between desktop and mobile, our buttons are getting just a little bit smaller. It's typically by 8 pixels, like we'll go between 56 and 48, 48 and 40, and then for the small, I'm actually only going from 40 to 36. Now less obviously, we also are updating our text styles as well. So this is the button text style for web, which is 16 pixels, and then on mobile, it actually decreases to 14. Now one of the most important things to note for our atoms is that size and breakpoint should be two separate variant properties. And the reason is a medium button on web is still a medium button on mobile. It's just the breakpoint that is changing. So all of our variant properties like type, size, state, those are going to persist across our different breakpoints. So what we want to do is make sure that we're not tying our breakpoints to a specific size. What I would recommend you not do is have something like medium be the button on web and small be the button on mobile. Those are going to be conflicting properties, and it's not going to map very well to how an engineer would actually build that out in code. So what you're going to want here is to make sure that breakpoint is its own property that doesn't conflict with anything like size or any of the other properties that you're outlining. Okay, next, let's talk about responsive organisms. By nature, organisms have more elements inside of them. So that means there's going to be an increased possibility of changes that we can make across breakpoints. So you're still going to make updates like size and padding and text styles, but you're also going to have these layout changes too. So you might flip the flex direction from vertical to horizontal or vice versa. Additionally, you're going to be swapping out different subcomponents because you might want to use different types across different breakpoints. Or maybe you want to switch from a desktop button to a mobile button, for instance. So if we look at this card component, I have my 5 total breakpoints here. 2XL, XL, large, medium, and small. And I have 3 types of cards that map to those 5 breakpoints. This works for the top 2 breakpoints, this works for the middle 2 breakpoints, and then this works for the small breakpoint. And remember, one of the things that we're trying to accomplish in responsive design is whenever possible, we want to maintain a consistent order in our layer list. And so this is a good example of how you can actually accomplish a lot without changing the order. All I'm doing here is switching between a vertical auto layout to a horizontal auto layout. And then for mobile, I'm just switching back to a vertical auto layout. But instead of solely switching the direction, I'm adding some style differences as well. Most obviously, I've added a white background to the card itself, and then a green border to the top. And then I've actually come in here And for the button, I've changed the type from primary to secondary. And that's totally fine. This change from primary to secondary is minimal in the code base. It's a single line of text. What would be much different is if I was reorganizing all of the content in a way that changed the layer list. This is nothing but cosmetics. And so the point of this side-by-side is you can create really, really unique designs across your breakpoints, all while maintaining a consistent layer list order within your organisms. Now let's use these inside of a layout here. This is still a single component. If I drill in here, I have one card grid that has my 3 breakpoints. All I've done is taken my card, wrapped it into a container, either a row or a column, depending on what breakpoint I'm designing for, and then I've just added a piece of text for a really simple example. Now it's important to note, I don't always create variants for these larger page layouts. It's not going to always make sense to have something called a card grid. Where I find myself using it a lot though is either on websites where I'm making a lot of changes at every single breakpoint and I want to be able to keep track of them. And then also in products where I have a consistent layout that I'm using and I'm going to be designing it across a ton of different instances. So maybe I'll have 20 different screens that are all tied back to one core layout. In that case, I will absolutely create a single variant for each breakpoint, because that way I have one source of truth and I can quickly pop in here and say, you know what, actually, let's make these a little bit tighter. And that's going to reflect across all of the pages that I'm designing for. So let's have a look at how these different layouts are changing across our breakpoints. If we drill into our largest layout right here, which we're using for the top 2 breakpoints, XL and XXL, the first thing we'll note is that we have this nice 32 pixels padding around the container itself, and then 24 pixels margin right here. And then if we look at this individual card row, you'll see it's set to fill container with space between. And so what that is indicating is on resize, the thing that is changing is the distance in between these cards right here. We don't actually care about the fixed pixel amount. We're saying that this space is growing as our screen size increases. Now, because this is the layout that we're using on the biggest possible screen sizes, we obviously don't want a situation where our cards are going to look like this. And so what we might do is put a max width on this container here. And even if we don't build it in Figma this way, we just need to communicate to developers, hey, actually, we never want this width to go above maybe something like 640 pixels. And perhaps we would even say that this content is centered to the screen. And that way, as we move down here, if I change this back to fill container, as we move down, it'll look like this. And as we grow, it's going to look like this. And this is a perfect example of why it's really beneficial to design at the largest and the smallest sizes within a given breakpoint. Because when we're using this same layout for multiple ranges, this here looks very different than something like this. And we need to be able to see both of those extremes and communicate them to developers. All right, so let's dig into our tablet breakpoint here, where we're using this for medium and large. And you can see the biggest change is we've flipped our auto layout direction of this card container to a column, which is a pretty common pattern that we're going to do a lot. But it's not just that. If we think back to our 3 variables that can change across different breakpoints, we have one, the space inherited from the parent container, which we want this to stay the same when we're resizing. And then we have the space in between items, which we also want to stay the same. So that leaves us with the size of the element itself. And you'll notice this is set to fill container. So if we grab this, we have this full spectrum that this layout needs to work for. It needs to work all the way up to something like 1023 pixels and all the way down to just before we switch to our mobile designs. And the key to making this work well has to do with how we build the main component itself. So if we drill into this main component, you'll see that this text container here is fill container, as well as all of the children elements. And that way, this image stays the same. It's fixed width, fixed height. We're preserving that aspect ratio. The button stays the same. We are relying on the text to be what grows and shrinks in order to update the width of this card right here. So if we head back over here, that's actually the biggest thing that's changing between these two breakpoints, is we're switching what variable is being altered as we're growing and shrinking. Here, it's the space between. Here, it's the width of the element itself. Now, if we look at mobile, we're still in that single column view, meaning that these cards are going to be what is growing and shrinking as we're looking at different mobile devices. The important thing, though, is that we're also making changes to our padding as well as our margin. We've shrunk that down to 16 pixels, and the padding is 16 pixels as well. And then we've even tightened this to be 16 pixels too. And these are pretty small changes, which is why I want to hammer home the point that it's so important that we communicate all of these different changes to developers, because they're not going to be able to look at this and quickly identify everything that is being updated across these different breakpoints, because we have changes happening at every level. Not only do we have changes to the layout and to these individual components, but even within the individual components, we have the buttons themselves, which are being updated to our smaller text styles and smaller icon sizes. And finally, when we're all done, we will have a beautiful setup like this, where we have all of these components with defined variants that tell us which ones to use at every single device size. They're going to be part of larger layouts that will also be tied to our breakpoints as well. And then all of the subcomponents or atoms, like our buttons, are going to be tied to our breakpoints too. So you'll see we have web, and then if we drill in here, we have mobile.